Welcome to the Move Smart podcast. I'm Justin Goodhart, and I'm super excited to have you with us here today. Our goal here is really to bring in thought leaders to give you world-class tips in movement, mobility, strength training, gymnastics, parkour, martial arts, nutrition, wellness, meditation, stress management, supplementation, handstands, and more. We want to teach you how to build a movement practice, maximize strength gains, improve recovery, customize your nutrition, and ultimately develop movement intelligence. Our motto here is be healthy to be strong. Be strong to be useful, and live long to maximize that usefulness. Because the longer and stronger you're able to pursue your higher purpose, the better every single person on the planet will become. In this episode, I'm going to be bringing on Todd Hargrove, who just wrote a fantastic new book. We're going to be talking about that a little bit, discussing why relearning of developmental movement patterns can be critical to improving mobility and performance. Then we'll get into body maps, what they are, why they matter, how to build them, and why a bad body map can mean a lack of mobility even if you're structurally sound. Then we're going to talk about how the nervous system is basically an extremely intelligent but overprotective mother, and what that means if you're trying to get stronger or more mobile. We're going to talk about the difference between stability, mobility, and flexibility, where to put your focus and attention to improve how quickly you learn a new movement or skill, what pain really means to the nervous system and what that means for your movement, and why you can have massive tissue damage without pain and no tissue damage with lots of pain. Then we're going to talk about why pain is a bad habit for the nervous system that can be extremely hard to break, just like any other habit, but it is possible. All this and more in this episode. Hope you enjoy and find something useful. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I got Todd Hargrove with me here and my co-host, Sean Maples. I'm super excited for this episode. Todd just published his book, A Guide to Better Movement, How to Move with More Skill and Less Pain. He's a former lawyer who used to be in a lot of chronic pain, tried everything, nothing worked, stumbled upon rolfing, and was so impressed by the success he had with that he quit his job as a lawyer, went to school, learned rolfing, and eventually the Feldenkrais method as well. And then he studied a huge variety of different movement approaches and philosophies, and now he's got a rolfing and movement education practice based in Seattle, and he's here today to talk to us about movement and his new book. So welcome, Todd.
Thank you very much for having me, Justin and Sean.
So did I miss anything there? Is there anything you want to add just about your background or sort of what led you to where you are today?
Oh, no, that's a pretty good summary, yeah. I was kind of an athlete growing up. I played a little bit of competitive tennis and some not so competitive other sports, and I was just kind of got to be kind of a movement geek in my 20s. Somehow I just became super interested in how to get better at the sports I was playing. I started competing a little bit in squash in my 20s, and for some reason I was much more into that process than I should have been, just because, I wasn't getting paid to do it. It wasn't my job, but I almost was taking that more seriously than my whole idea of how to get better at sports. And so I kind of started studying that a lot. And at the same time, I had chronic pain, so I was studying that, and I kind of saw some overlap between those two things. And that's kind of what got me started on this stuff.
Great. So what's really the reason you decided to write this book? What was really the driving force behind that?
Yeah, there's kind of a couple of reasons. One is that I saw that there was a lot of misinformation out there about pain and about movement. So, I see a lot of, myths out there like everyone else does. And I also see that there's kind of like this new paradigm coming along, particularly in pain science. There's been some really big advances in pain science in the past 20 years, and it seems that a lot of the people that treat pain are kind of slow to take these new approaches into account. So I wanted to kind of popularize that a little bit. There's quite a lot of talk on the internet about the importance of pain education and, physical therapists and other people who treat pain being a little bit more aware of pain science. So I kind of wanted to get the word out there. Also, I'd been writing a blog since almost 2008 with a bunch of kind of disparate material, and I kind of wanted to organize it all into one consumable piece that would be kind of like more popularly accessible. Also, I just kind of have a lot of these ideas running around in my head, and when I get them down on paper, I can stop wasting all the mental energy to keep it organized in that way.
Yeah, I hear you. I think you did a really good job of walking that line between being technical and scientific enough to be very credible and informative, but also said things in a simple enough way to really be accessible to the general public.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Sean, do you have any questions? Why don't you go ahead and ask Todd one of your questions?
I have so many questions, Justin. First, I was curious, you're a pool player as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, if we ever meet, I'll just make sure not to throw down any money on that game.
Well, I'm pretty rusty with the pool skills, but luckily I think those stick around more than skills that are based more on strength, speed, and athleticism.
Yeah, and one of the takeaways that I got in reading your book was this idea of transference. And I know Justin and I think about this a little bit because we train across modalities quite frequently. And if you think of something like the skills that you might acquire in playing a game as simple as pool and how those might transfer to, say, something more taxing on your system like rock climbing, it's actually all part of the same puzzle. So you're learning how to use your hands in a very specific way, creating some brain mapping, and that the result of that mapping is increased control of those appendages.
Yeah, that transfer question, I mean, that's really the question, isn't it? I kind of address it a little bit in the book, and I think it's really, it's something that everybody who's done any kind of training, whether it's personal trainers or sports trainers or physical therapists, it's always the big question. If you learn this new skill that we want you to learn, like squatting or lunging, will that really transfer to the field of play and make you better at whatever you're doing? And I don't claim to have any really good answers to that, but I think that the place to look, my kind of model for understanding what types of movements will transfer better to other activities, which types of movements will be very generally beneficial, is to look at developmental movements. Because when we're little babies and rolling around in the floor, we're kind of like learning the building blocks for all of the other things we're going to do. So kids are, little babies are learning head control. They're learning how to orient their head and how to look around and stabilize their head. And that's something that they're going to need when they do almost anything else. When they're crawling, when they're walking, you have to have that fundamental building block in place. And then they go along and they learn reaching movements and midline stabilization when they're rolling over. And then the cross-lateral patterns they use when they're crawling are also used in walking. So there's all these fundamental things that they learn, and then they're useful. You kind of like use them as a language, these simple words to build up and form more complex movement sentences. But I do think that there are certain movements that you could learn that are highly specific and don't have a lot of transfer. So if I went out and got better at my tennis serve, I'd get better at my tennis serve, but I wouldn't likely get better at almost anything else. But if I got better at some really fundamental movement, like maybe squatting or lunging, that might be something that transfers over into tons of other sports. So with the pool, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't think that my getting better at pool probably helped me with anything else. I think it made me better at maybe snooker or billiards, but I don't think it would have helped me that much at rock climbing.
Yeah, that kind of ties into, you've written an article about this on your blog as well, the SAID principle, or specific adaptation to impose demands, and I think that can apply a lot. I'm curious, so you talk a little bit in the book about body maps. And so I'm curious how you would define a body map, why you would consider it important, and how do you create one, like practically for someone who is maybe, learning some basic gymnastics or, like Sean said, rock climbing or anything like that. How do you begin to build these body maps?
So maps means the representations in the brain, the neural representations that govern perception or movement of a particular body part. So you've got a hand, and you've got like a virtual hand in your brain. You've got there's a certain amount of real estate in your brain which is devoted to perceiving and moving that hand. And if you've ever seen a picture of a homunculus, like if listeners could do an image search for homunculus, you'd see a picture of a guy with these huge hands and huge lips and very small rest of the body. And what a homunculus is, it's a visual representation of what you would look like if all the different parts of your body were the same size as the parts of your brain which go to work at perceiving and moving those different body parts. So because we've got a hand which is capable of all these really dexterous and fine motor skills, and because we have great perception of the hand, we need a really big part of the brain devoted to sensing and moving the hand. And so we do have one. And there's other parts of the body, like the middle of the back, even the legs. The representation in the brain is a lot smaller, which means that, we don't really need as intense coordination and perception in those areas. And the interesting thing is the size of these maps changes over time based on how much you use them. So if I start moving my hand around in a coordinated way, the maps for the hand would be kind of lighting up in the brain. And if I put my hand under a lot of demand, like if I was playing an instrument or if I was learning Braille, the size of my hand maps would literally grow observably larger in the brain. So you can do various ways of measuring that, and you find that people who read Braille, musicians, literally have bigger hand maps in the brain, and that's because they're really putting them to the test. And these maps operate like a lot of other things in the body on kind of a use it or lose it basis. So if you don't place your body maps under a lot of demand, if you're not really using them to make precise, if you're not trying to precisely observe what's going on in your body, or you're not moving it with coordination, the maps will get what we would call fuzzy, or they'll kind of blur a little bit. So there's this famous experiment by a neuroscientist named Merzenich, where he sewed together some fingers on a monkey. So before the experiment, the monkeys got independent movement and sensation in the fingers, and two different parts of the brain, separate maps in the brain, oriented towards perceiving and moving those fingers. But you sew the fingers together, and they move as a unit for a couple weeks, I think it is. Then you recheck the brain maps, and you find that they're now blurred together. So the physical fingers become one unit, and then the fingers in the map become one unit as well. And so I think that this is kind of what happens a little bit in our everyday lives if we don't use all the differentiated movements that are available to us. So a lot of people, the area around their hips and their lower spine, they just kind of sit in a chair, and the area works as one big block. After a while, that area in your brain is represented as one big block. So even if you have the capability of moving that area, the structural capability to move it in a differentiated way, you no longer have the software to do that. So, very long answer to your question. Part of the way we develop these maps is by putting them to the test, making them do their job of giving us awareness and perception of what's going on in the body, and trying to move the body in a coordinated way.
Gotcha.
So sorry for the long answer.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. So I'm curious then, from a practical standpoint, do you encourage your clients or athletes or anyone who's about to go engage in something strenuous, do you encourage them to go through like a full body mobility mapping for that individual movement or training session? Or what sort of recommendation or encouragement would you have for people there?
First of all, I should say I'm not a personal trainer. I don't often coordinate the warm-ups of people that are doing sports and stuff like that. But I do make a brief mention of this in the book, which is that part of what gets warmed up for any physical activity that you're going to do, like if I was going to go play tennis, I'd need to warm up all my muscles for sure. I need to literally get my body hot. But I'd also have to activate or warm up the neural connections in my brain which are responsible for executing those skills. So part of the warm-up you can think of as a neural warm-up. You execute the skills, you start slow, and then you kind of get those areas active, then you get them woken up, and then you'll be able to execute your tasks. That's what people kind of instinctively do when they're warming up for anything they're going to do. Soccer players, before the game, they pass the ball around. They make sure their skills are awake.
So you spoke a little bit about sitting. I know that I confront this quite frequently with my clients and even myself over time. Is as a culture, we sit a great deal. And I think a lot of effort goes into reversing some of the damage that sitting does, specifically in locking up the hip flexors, among other issues there. So when you're talking about creating movement where movement is available, what are some steps that you can recommend for people that want to unlock their joints or just get back to that level of mobility that they had previously?
One of the concepts I talk about in the book is graded exposure. So if you want to recover a movement that's been lost, or you want to get anything done physically, whether that's be stronger or have greater range of motion or stuff like that. And this is a very, very common sense principle that's embodied in any intelligent program. You basically start moving in the direction that you want to go and do that with enough intensity to cause some adaptation to occur. So if you want to get stronger, you're going to have to start lifting more weights. And you have to do that with enough intensity that the body is going to feel the stress of that and make some adaptation to get stronger. At the same time, you don't want to use so much intensity that you injure yourself in the process. So that, a similar principle would govern getting back any ranges of motion that have been lost. So if you're stiff into hip extension, or if you can't get into a full squat, You use a process of graded exposure to very kind of slowly and carefully start moving yourself back into that position and, get yourself adapted to it. And one of the things that I talk about in the book a little bit, which might add a little something to just that common sense idea, is the idea of the way the nervous system deals with threat. So the nervous system doesn't want you, or it can be threatened by movements that we might not consider to be threatening. So going to the end range of a joint, it might not be something that's really going to hurt you, but your nervous system is always monitoring the position of the joints, and if it feels even a little bit of discomfort going into the end range position, it's basically going to maybe send you a little bit of a pain signal to discourage you from doing that. And most people will just kind of push through that. They say, well, I don't really care if there's really any pain in the stretch. I'm going to keep going. In that event, it'll probably use some other way to protect you from what it thinks might be a dangerous situation, which might be just stiffening the muscle up. So if you're trying to, say, stretch your hip flexors, a lot of people will just really grind on that and push through the pain. And that could be counterproductive because one of the things the nervous system might do to protect you from what it thinks is a dangerous situation is basically to just stiffen up the hip flexors. So you could kind of walk away from intense stretching like that, maybe feeling stiffer than when you started because you're not fully respecting the fact that it's the nervous system that gets to decide how long those hip flexors are.
I really like the idea you talk about in the book, the nervous system as an extremely intelligent but overprotective mother. That really stuck out to me. So would you consider it intelligent then to also attempt to build strength where there is flexibility? Just kind of signal to the nervous system that, okay, I have the strength to come out of this position, so I'm going to let you go into this position. What's your take on that?
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I have the perspective in the book, and I ask my readers to take on this perspective. Let's imagine that your nervous system was an overprotective mother. It's really, really, really concerned with your safety. It involved in a situation, millions of years ago, where having a hamstring strain or having a sprained ankle might be the difference between life or death. In the modern world, that's not the case at all, but you've still got a nervous system which is really oriented towards your survival, not necessarily your performance. So you may want to get into the splits really bad, but your nervous system, which in many ways controls your ability to do that, might not want you to do that at all because it thinks that getting a groin strain would be a horrible thing to do. So, kind of like looking at from this perspective, what could you do to reassure this overprotective mother that it would be safe to get into a real extended joint range of motion? One thing you could do was be to kind of show it that I've got a lot of coordination and control at this end range of motion. So that would suggest that a good way to increase range of motion is not just to wail away at some passive stretch, but to do something functionally interesting at that end range of motion, something that the nervous system might consider to be a valuable function that it wants to get done. You could show the nervous system that you've got stability, control, and coordination in that position, and you can also, as you just said, show it that you've got the strength to get back to the neutral position. And that's something that I see a lot of people talking about these days, like Andrea Ospina's got some interesting ideas about the importance of having strength at the end range of motion.
Yeah.
And getting strength at that end range of motion is something that's going to encourage the nervous system to let you have it, but also give you the ability to do something functionally useful with that end range of motion.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of Dr. Spina's work, and I hope to have him on the show at some point in the future as well.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, and there's great dialogue there as well about stability and mobility. And I know you touched on this in your book, and I was hoping you could go into a little more detail about the difference between developing stability and mobility in a joint.
Yeah, so different people define these things a little bit differently, but I define mobility, well, let's see, I distinguish it from flexibility. Flexibility, I would say, is just your range of motion at a certain joint, getting from A to B. And mobility, I know Spina defines mobility as flexibility plus strength or something like that. That's a good definition, but I defined it as your functional control over the range of motion that you have. So I might have very good flexibility in my hips. I might be able to get into the splits, and I definitely can't do that, by the way. But mobility would be my ability to take advantage, to really functionally take advantage of large ranges of motion at the hips. To use an example of that, I remember playing some people in squash who literally could do the splits, but they were not necessarily very capable of getting into this very, very deep extended lunge position that you often get into in squash to reach a ball. So they would have had great flexibility, but not necessarily mobility. And stability I define as just the ability to control unwanted motion in the body. And there's tons of unwanted motions you can have. Most of the potential motions you can have in the body are not useful or even safe. Part of stability involves these really, really small, almost kind of micro movements within a joint. Like you can imagine your shoulder joint, all the play that's available there, the different ways that ball can interact with the socket, kind of little small differences in the way they're positioned might make a big difference in the safety of the joint or whether that ball is bumping into some soft tissues in the socket. Yeah, so they're both good concepts for understanding what type of movement quality you might need more of. And I like the way Gray Cook talks about this kind of stuff, like trying to distinguish between a mobility issue or a stability issue. I think those are good concepts too, and I don't talk so much about that in the book, though.
Cool. So, Todd, when someone is learning a new skill, can you talk a little bit about external versus internal motor learning and where people should direct their attention and what difference that makes?
Yeah, I touch on this just a little bit in the book, but there's actually a ton of very interesting research out there. I think it's by Gabriel Wolf. And Nick Winkelman is someone who I always see giving good presentations on this same idea, which is the idea that it seems like external cues or directing your attention externally seems to have a very big advantage over internal cues, or directing your attention internally when you're trying to learn a motor skill. So what's the difference between external and internal? External attention, when you're doing some skill, means that you try to pay attention to what's going on in the environment around you or how your movement is affecting the external environment. And internal is when you pay attention to what's going on in your own body. So just to give an example, if I wanted to cue someone to jump higher in their vertical leap, an internal cue would be really try to powerfully extend your hips. You're directing their attention to what's going on in their body. The external cue would be push your feet into the ground as hard as you can, or try and bump your head against the ceiling. You're directing their attention to how their body is affecting the environment. And the interesting thing is that the research really strongly shows that the external causes people to learn a lot faster. And I see a lot of the personal trainers whose blogs that I follow talking about how they're kind of shifting a lot of their cueing. Just as one example, I noticed that Eric Cressy and Tony Gentilcore will talk about when you're in the bottom position of a deadlift and you want the client, lift their chest and extend their chest. Well, instead of telling them to get some thoracic extension, which is an internal cue, they'll now say, hey, show me the logo on your shirt. So you're trying to, their direction's going in externally. They're trying to affect something outside of them. And that's an example of shifting from internal to external cue. Another example of that would be, maybe if you're in a squat and you want someone to activate their glutes a little bit more or kind of like externally rotate their femurs, you might tell them to activate their glutes or externally rotate their femurs, or you could say, spread the floor with your feet. Imagine you're spreading the floor with your feet. That's kind of the external way to do the same thing.
Yeah, I like that because I think a lot of high-level coaches do this intuitively, and
yes,
it seems like external cues just tend to be so much more concrete and easy to understand.
Yeah, exactly.
So does that dovetail into the difference between mentally trying to learn a movement versus performing some sort of functional task or like trying to solve some sort of movement problem? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. It's kind of like the difference between focusing on the outcome of what you're doing or focusing on exactly how you're doing it. If you really think about exactly how you're doing a particular movement, that can cause kind of like a paralysis by analysis type of a situation. And we really tend to perform better when we relate what we're doing to changing something in the environment, because that's why our movement system evolved. It evolved to solve functional problems. So whenever you can, make some movement practice related to some functional task that it's kind of very natural for us to be trying to achieve, you're probably going to get a little bit better results. And that's why in the lessons in my book, I try as much as possible to relate movements to these kind of common functions that we all know how to perform, like reaching, orienting your head to see, or moving from one position to another.
Yeah.
As opposed to just, try to, flex and extend your back. Let's say you're doing a cat-cow movement. You could say arch and round your back and try to, flex and extend your spine. Well, that's one way to do it. But another thing you can say would be look up to the horizon, look down in between your legs. That's going to cause you to get that same movement in your spine. It's tied to a function, the function of seeing things. And people tend to mobilize their bodies in more coordinated ways if they're doing it in connection with a functional task.
Absolutely. And not that there isn't, and you even talk a little bit about this in your book, not that there isn't a place for the internal perspective or internal focus, but a lot of people have much better outcomes when they focus on how they are manipulating or interacting with the environment.
Yeah, I do think that there's a place for internal cues, and Brett Contreras has talked about this as well when he's written some blogs about, squeezing your glutes as hard as you can. Is that an external cue? No, that's an internal cue, but that could have some value. And there's a lot of movements that we'd like people to be doing in a slightly different way, but it's very hard to come up with the external cue for that. So, and this is the case with a lot of the movements that physical therapists or corrective exercise people are trying to improve. So if you want your breathing to be different, if you want, your posture to be different, these other subtle movements, sometimes there's not a really obvious external manifestation of anything that's going on in the environment. You can't get that objective feedback of how you're doing something. So you're going to have to learn to get a little bit better body awareness and actually get that internal sensation of what's going on in your body. Another example, let's say you're squatting and you want to prevent your low back from rounding out too much. There might not be a really obvious external cue or any obvious external feedback that's going to give you that information. You're going to have to get that internal perception of where your back is at by spending some time paying attention to what does it feel like to have my back in a neutral position? What does it feel like to have my back in an arched position? What does it feel like to have my back in a rounded position? You internally direct your attention so you build up a better awareness there until subtle things become very, very obvious to you. And so that you'll know when you're going into a squat what your low back is doing.
I was interested in your mention of posture in the book as something that's dynamic, and the use of a plumb line as not being a universal metric for measuring optimal posture. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I define posture as just a static position that you're in, and you're basically waiting for something else to happen. There's not a lot of gross movement going on. You're just kind of hanging out waiting for the next thing to happen. And there's different postures are appropriate in different situations. So, if you're waiting in line at the bank, then a standing posture is the appropriate posture. If you're waiting in the outfield, waiting for a ball to be hit to you, the appropriate posture is probably something in your athletic crouch situation. So posture, it always needs to be preparing you for the next movement that's about to happen. And depending on whatever that next movement is, a different type of a posture will be appropriate. Yeah, if I am just squared away in my living room and I know that the only thing that's going to happen is for me to need to click the remote control, then very reclined posture is appropriate. But if I know I might need to get out of the room really quickly, then I might be on the edge of my seat. So posture always relates to whatever functional activity you're trying to perform. Another reason the plumb line is not that good of an idea is that different people have different structures, so different postures will be optimal for them. Some people have bones which are not going to stack themselves into a perfect plumb line. If you have scoliosis, if you ask that person to line their spine up in a totally straight line, you're basically asking them to take their joints out of neutral, because the joints aren't shaped in such a way as to go into a straight line. Another thing about posture that a lot of people get wrong is that there is a very surprising lack of correlation between measurements of posture and chronic pain. So we all have heard a million times that if you have bad posture, that will cause chronic pain, or that if you have chronic pain, you can get rid of that by improving your posture. But there have been many, many, many studies done where they take a population of people, they measure, let's say, their degree of anterior tilt to their pelvis, how much lumbar lordosis they have, how much kyphosis they have, Try to take as many different measurements as you can of posture and predict who's going to have pain. You're not going to be able to do it. Most of these studies find there's not a good correlation between measurements of posture and chronic pain.
So would it be fair to say then that an appropriate posture in any given moment is one that gives us the most options for movement based on our goals right then?
Yeah, I really like that idea. I like the idea of being in neutral and preserving. This is a Moshe Feldenkrais idea that I like. Feldenkrais invented the Feldenkrais method, and I've got some exercises at the end of the book that are based on this. And his idea was that good posture would mean the ability to move in any direction with a minimum of preparation. And I think that's a really good definition. So take a picture of an athlete playing soccer, playing basketball. When you see them in the middle of the action, you see this sense of balance and control, and you see that they can move in any direction at any time. They're always preserving their ability to go right, to go left, to go forward, or to go back. That's what confuses the defender. That's why the defender doesn't know where they're going to go, because they're so well balanced. They're always in neutral. They've always got a full array of options. And I think if you think of posture in this way, even when you're just sitting in your chair, if you're sitting in your chair, can you very easily turn to the left and to the right? Can you rise from the chair easily and transition into a sitting position? Can you reach for things that you need to reach for? If you can do all those things, I think you'll find yourself sitting with a pretty good, comfortable, relaxed, functional posture.
Cool. So we've talked a little bit about posture, how it can be dynamic, and how preserving our options is the essence of good posture. What about novel movement? What's the purpose and use of novel movement, and how do you encourage people to start exploring novel movements, and for what goals?
Yeah, so part of the idea with novel movements is that the way the brain controls your movement, it's kind of like an information processing situation. So it's always gathering information from the periphery of the body, interpreting the meaning of it to figure out where everything is and what's going on in the body. And once it knows that, then it can issue motor commands to move things where they're supposed to go. And as soon as those commands are made, there's more feedback about what just happened. So the intelligence of your coordination is really going to depend on the information that's coming from the body. When you get novel information, it can change the way that you move the body and perceive the body, because now you've got a new piece of information, maybe a different way of looking at movement or the body that maybe the brain wasn't aware of before, and this is something that's more likely to make a change in movement. Novel information also gets your attention, and having a focused attention on what you're doing is necessary to perform really well and to learn really well. So I think novel movement is a movement which is likely, it might be something that gets the brain's interest, gets its attention, and it might be the kind of a critical piece of information that helps the brain solve a movement puzzle that it's currently struggling with.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That's great. So I guess, is it fair to say that your individual novel movements may evolve over time as you learn what these novel movements are and they stop being novel? You may need to sort of expand your repertoire of novel movements.
Yeah. So this reminds me a little bit about what we were talking before about this use it or lose it idea in terms of movement. So let's say people are sitting in a chair a lot. They're habitually neglecting certain subtle movements that they might be able to make in their hips or their low back. So if you kind of go out of your way to find novel movements, to move in an unusual way, you may go through a process of kind of reminding yourself of movements that you used to be able to make. It's kind of like a systematic way of identifying movements that you might have been habitually avoiding. There's this concept called sensory motor amnesia, which I really like. It means that you used to know how to make this certain move with your pelvis or your hips. You were doing it when you were a kid all the time. Now you've gone to school for 5 to 10 years and been sitting in a chair, and you've just neglected that for so many years. You've forgotten how to do it enough that you never take advantage of that movement anymore. So if you kind of deliberately go through a process of trying to move in new ways, you might remind yourself of some of these movement options that you used to have. You kind of know how to do it, but you've just kind of forgotten how to make that movement.
Can you talk a little bit about the accumulation of tension in the body? You talk about parasitic tension, and I'm curious about this for several reasons, but mostly because, as humans today, we encounter so many different stressors in our day-to-day life, and specifically when we stop moving for long periods of time, we get an accumulation of either those stressors or lock joints or what have you.
Yeah, so this idea of parasitic tension, that's another phrase that Moshe Feldenkrais developed, and I kind of like this idea. It basically means that, let's say you've got some intended movement that you want to do. You want to reach for something or you want to do any particular movement, and there's a certain amount of musculature that you need to activate to go ahead and get that movement done. The parasitic tension is muscle tension, which isn't really necessary to getting the job done. It's not really helping you get the job done. It might even be interfering with getting the job done. But you are in the habit of always using this excess tension as you move. So it's like a parasite on the host movement. The host movement is like the movement that you want to get done, but you've got this parasitic tension going along for the ride. Just one example of that might be, let's say that every time you reach for a computer mouse, maybe you tense your jaw just a little bit, just as like a little habit of doing that. You might never notice doing that until you actually paid attention. Here's an example of a parasitic movement which isn't really damaging at all, but it's interesting. Whenever Michael Jordan would do almost anything in the basketball court, he would stick his tongue out, right? So that's an example of a parasitic movement. He could still get the ball in the hoop. There was no problem there. But it's just a movement that somehow became attached in his brain to the other movements in basketball. But we can have these kind of parasitic movements that are kind of really undesirable, and they involve excess tension. And what I do in some of the lessons in the book is I ask people to go ahead and make these kind of simple movements and just kind of scan your body for what parts of you are participating in the movement. Do you feel any excess tension anywhere as you do this simple movement? And if so, is it possible to kind of break that parasitic connection to make your movement more efficient, get rid of some unnecessary tension?
So we've talked a little bit about novel movement, all those things. I want to wrap it up here in just a few more minutes, but I'm really curious to talk a little bit more about pain. So, Todd, what is the purpose of pain, and why do we have these perceptions of pain, and what do they really mean to the nervous system?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The purpose of pain is to encourage you to engage in protective behaviors. So pain evolved as a way to alert you to the presence of potential tissue damage and danger, and to get you to do something about it. It's pretty obvious. So if you've got a dangerous condition down in your foot, you've sprained the ankle, the tissues are in danger. There's little sensors down in the foot which will pick up the danger, whether it's mechanical danger in the form of too much mechanical input, or there's an inflammatory condition, that's a chemical sensor would pick that up, or if there's too much heat, the temperature sensors would pick that up. They send a message all the way up to the brain. The brain interprets the meaning of that and says, hey, there's a dangerous situation down there in the foot. So what are we going to do? We're going to create pain to encourage this person who owns the body to start limping around and protect themselves from this dangerous situation. And it's a good question to ask, what is the purpose of pain? Because once we understand that purpose, we can understand a little bit better about why we have pain and why we don't. The purpose of pain is not just to be holding up a mirror to the body. It's to encourage protective behaviors. So there are times when your brain might not really want to create pain, even though there is tissue damage, because it's going to encourage behaviors which actually aren't going to protect you very well at all. Let's imagine you're in an emergency situation. You're a soldier that's just gotten a horrible injury. So a lot of people in that situation will actually not feel any pain at all. And it's probably because pain would not really help them survive that situation very well at all. If you were in screaming in pain, you're not going to be able to get out of this emergency situation very well. So what very often happens in these emergency situations is people don't feel any pain despite huge tissue damage until they get into a safe situation in the emergency room. And you see this in sports as well. A lot of times people get really bad injuries on the sporting field, but because your nervous system is probably interpreting this as like a semi-emergency situation, there's no pain at the time. And, in soccer, this situation is completely reversed. Of course, you never see anyone get injured in the soccer field without crying about it. And usually you see people, totally pretending to be in incredible pain when there's no injuries at all. There was an incredible example of this in a basketball game. I think the guy's name was Kevin Ware. I think it might have been in college. And he was on the side of the court, and there was a horrible break where he had an open break and his bone was coming out. And he was just sitting there looking at it. He was not feeling any pain at the time. And he said later that I didn't feel any pain at the time. You can Google these things. You need kind of a strong stomach, but it's a really cool example of how when you have a lot of tissue damage, you won't necessarily have pain.
So basically what you're saying is that pain is not a perfect reflection of what's going on in the body, and that you can have pain when there's no tissue or structural damage, and conversely, you can have no pain at all when there's massive tissue damage. And I think that's an important distinction. So how can people, let's say they have pain, or I like this idea that pain can almost become a habit for the nervous system. So if there's people out there who have pain but no longer have this tissue damage that first began accompanying the pain, how can people start to break this habit of pain for the nervous system?
Well, it's not easy for sure, and this is the reason it's tough to deal with chronic pain. And there's actually researchers have been looking at this, and it's frustrating. There are not any magic bullets for dealing with chronic pain, and I think the word habit that you just used illustrates part of the reason why. It's easier for us probably to build a good new habit than it is for us to lose an old bad habit. It's very challenging to get rid of a bad habit, to quit smoking, to lose weight, to do almost anything that's become a habit. It's hard to make a change there because the neural pathways, the parts of your nervous system that govern that behavior, you've engaged in them so many times that they've become very facilitated. It's very easy for them to get activated. I used the analogy in the book of skiing down a mountain. So the first time you ski down a mountain, you can take any path equally because the snow's all pure there. But once you start ski down once, the next time you go down, you're going to be kind of like biased to go down that same pathway again. And then you go down again and again, and you're forming this deep groove. This is how we learn things and how we develop habits. So if you have pain, the same pain over and over, once it becomes a period of months and you're in a chronic situation, the neural pathways which help create that painful experience are like you're falling into a groove there, and it can be hard to get out of that groove. And to get out of the groove, I think that's where this idea of novel movements comes in. Pain education can be an important way to get out of the groove. Changing the way you think about pain is one of the inputs that can change whether you have it. And we're kind of getting into a whole different area there. But I guess the main point I want to stress is that pain can become a groove, it can become a habit, and getting out of it is challenging, just as challenging as breaking any other kind of habit.
Brilliant. Good stuff. So in closing then, Todd, what are 3 practical tips that or pieces of advice you have for people who are wanting to improve their movement practice, move better, perhaps get out of pain, just from your accumulated wisdom over the years that you've learned?
Good question. I would say that if you're going to focus, and I'll kind of restrict this to movement qualities as opposed to kind of fitness or diet or things like that. Obviously, for sure, being fit, being in good shape, being strong, sleeping well, eliminating stress, having a good diet, those things are incredibly important. But my book kind of focuses on qualities of movement a little bit more, so I'll kind of try and stick to that a little bit. As far as working on your movement quality, I would say focus your movement practice on movements that are developmental building block type of movements. So in other words, work on your squats, your lunges, your pushes, your pulls. I think there's a reason why these exercises are the mainstays of most personal trainers have hit upon as the biggest bang for your buck type of exercises to do. Movements that are kind of natural movements, functional movements, climbing, running, crawling, rolling, gymnastic types movements. These are the kind of things that are likely to be building blocks for other movements and have a lot of transfer. Another thing that I would say is pay attention to what you're doing as you're doing it. Focus your attention on the results of your movements, the functional goals that you're trying to achieve. Don't just go through the motions in a mindless way. Quality practice is built up from, having that focus and having a coach there as well to give you objective feedback about what you're doing where that feedback is not available. That'll be really helpful. And I think the third thing that I might say is, respect and understand the way your nervous system responds to threat. When your nervous system perceives a threatening situation, it's going to make you stiff, it's going to make you weak, it's going to put you in pain, and it's going to alter your coordination programs to protect you from yourself, even if you don't want that protection. It's an overprotective mother. It's going to shut down movements that it doesn't want you to make. So respect that and understand that process. Don't push yourself too hard. Give yourself the right dosage of intensity and threat, and always try to be sending as much good news to that overprotective mother as possible about your movement capabilities.
Great. Thanks. That's amazing. Again, those were focus on developmental movements. Second one was be mindful and ideally have a coach there. And the third one was really respect the nervous system and how it responds to threat. Those are amazing tips. Guys, again, this book that Todd just wrote, it's called A Guide to Better Movement, the Science and Practice of Moving with More Skill and Less Pain. It's available on Amazon, available on Todd's site. I think he just put out the Kindle form, and the Nook version is coming in a couple days. Todd, how can people get in touch with you? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, the easiest way is to go to my blog at bettermovement.org. I've got 5 years of articles there. Like I said before, that they touch on all these different subjects. You can kind of search for different subjects there, and all the information is kind of much more organized in the book, but the blog is a great place to start and to get in touch with me.
Great. Sean, any closing comments?
No, I think that was great. Just want to thank you, Todd, for taking out the time, and really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, and great questions. I appreciate it.
Great. You can get in touch with me at wellroundedathlete.net and facebook.com/wellroundedathlete. Again, I'd appreciate it if you could rate the show in iTunes. And I love any and all feedback, constructive, positive, negative, whatever it is. You can email me at justin@wellroundedathlete.net. Sean, how can people get in touch with you?
And you can find me at redrevive.com or sean@redrevive.com on email.
Well, again, Todd, huge thanks, man. Like I said, I really enjoyed the book. It's really kind of opened my eyes to a whole, like I said, almost the third great phase in my movement practice, and I highly, highly recommend it. I can't recommend it enough. So if you're listening, go out and buy the book. You won't regret it. You'll learn some amazing, amazing things.
Thanks a lot, Justin. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thanks again for listening. I'll post the show notes on my website, wellroundedathlete.net, and if you could please post a rating or review in iTunes, I will personally give you a hug the next time I see you. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.